The last light of the farmhouse burned brighter than the stars that hung above the prairie. Far from the city's noise and the bustle of highways, a single man walked to the barn in the darkness before dawn. The world around him was wrapped in a quiet so complete that every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of frost under boots, the creak of a gate, the distant call of a lone owl. This is the story of Earl Mitchell, a 68-year-old Iowa farmer who has spent half a century on the same land his father once bought with sweat and sacrifice. It is a story about resilience, integrity, hard work, faith, and the unbreakable spirit forged on American soil. It is also a story about loneliness, the kind that comes from watching neighbors move away, watching towns shrink, and carrying the weight of generations on your shoulders while the rest of the world seems to hurry past. Before we begin, take a moment to consider where you are watching this video from. Small town or big city, farm or suburb, it matters because these stories connect us. If you find meaning in tales of perseverance and quiet heroism, consider subscribing to our channel. Every week we bring you new stories celebrating the people who feed the nation and keep the Heartland alive. Now, let's step into Earl's world. Earl's day began long before the sun lifted over the horizon. He awoke at 4:30 every morning without an alarm clock, his body conditioned by decades of routine. The first thing he did was reach for his worn leather Bible on the nightstand. He said a short prayer of gratitude for the fact that there was still work to do. In a farmhouse that once housed a family of 6, only Earl's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. The hallway walls were lined with sepia photographs. His parents on their wedding day, his grandfather holding up a prize hog at a county fair, himself and his brothers as children perched atop a tractor. Those faces watched as he pulled on, his heavy denim overalls and boots, and headed out to check on the cattle. The pre-dawn air bit through his jacket as he walked across the yard. Frost coated the grass and glittered in the beam of his flashlight. In the barn, he moved with practiced efficiency, filling feed troughs, breaking the thin ice that had formed over the water buckets, and running his hands along the flanks of the animals to check for any sign of illness. For most of his life, this work had been done with his father at his side and later with his own children. Now he did it alone, relying on habit, muscle memory, and a deep sense of duty to keep going. On cold mornings, he sometimes paused to listen to the wind and the low, rhythmic chewing of the cattle. It was in these quiet moments that the weight of solitude pressed most heavily on him. Farming was not just a job, it was a life, and for Earl, that life had become increasingly solitary as the years passed. To understand why Earl chose this path, we need to look back. Earl's father, John Mitchell, returned from World War II and bought a small parcel of land in rural Iowa. It was not much, just a few hundred acres of rolling hills and fertile soil, but for John, it represented freedom and a chance to build something with his own hands. The 1950s and 1960s were good years for small farmers. The town near their farm bustled with activity. Main Street was lined with hardware stores, feed suppliers, diners, and a movie theater. On Saturdays, families gathered for church picnics, high school football games, and community events. Earl grew up surrounded by cousins, neighbors, and friends. He learned to drive a tractor long before he was old enough for a car. He watched his parents work from sunrise to sunset, battling droughts, pests, and unpredictable commodity prices, yet somehow always making ends meet. He absorbed his father's values, a belief in hard work, a deep faith, and an understanding that land is more than property. It is heritage. When Earl graduated from high school in 1975, he had offers to go to college and explore careers in nearby cities, but he felt a pull back to the farm. He remembered his father's calloused hands, the way his mother sang hymns while cooking breakfast, the sight of golden wheat fields swaying under a July sky. He could not imagine leaving that behind. So he stayed. He married his high school sweetheart built a house on the back 40, and started his own family. Together, Earl and his wife raised 3 children on the farm, passing down the same lessons of faith and perseverance that had shaped him. For a while, the farm was full of laughter, chores shared among many hands, and meals eaten around a crowded table. But as time went on, the world around them changed. In the 1980s, American agriculture faced a crisis that would redefine rural life. High interest rates, low crop prices, and increasing debt forced many small farmers to sell or foreclose. The farm crisis of that era devastated communities across the Midwest. Friends of the Mitchell family lost their land. Neighbors moved to cities for factory jobs. Schools consolidated as populations dwindled. The sense of community that had once been the bedrock of rural life began to erode. Earl watched this unfold with a mixture of fear and determination. He refused to give up. Instead, he diversified his crops, learned new farming techniques, and took on part-time work driving trucks during the off-season to pay the bills. His wife started a small home business, selling baked goods and handmade crafts to supplement their income. They scrimped, saved, and prayed. The farm survived, but it did not escape unscathed. The stress took a toll on Earl's health. He developed high blood pressure and arthritis in his hands. The hours were long, and there were nights when he would sit at the kitchen table with bills spread out before him, feeling overwhelmed by numbers that never seemed to add up. There were also nights when he stared at the empty fields under a full moon and wondered if it was worth it. Yet each morning he rose before dawn and went back to work. He was driven by more than economics. He felt a duty to honor his father's legacy, to keep the land in his family, and to show his children that perseverance can carry you through the hardest seasons. As the years turned into decades, Earl's children grew up and left home. His eldest son received a scholarship to study engineering and eventually moved to Des Moines. His daughter married a teacher and relocated to a town 2 hours away. His youngest son joined the military and later settled on the East Coast. They visited when they could, especially during harvest and holidays, but their lives were elsewhere. Earl did not fault them. He had raised them to pursue their dreams, and he was proud of what they had achieved. Still, the empty bedrooms in the farmhouse were a daily reminder of how life had changed. Earl's wife, whose laughter once filled the kitchen, was diagnosed with cancer in her late 50s. Despite treatments and prayers, she passed away in the early spring of 2010. Her loss left a hole in the farm that no amount of hard work could fill. The days that followed were some of the darkest of Earl's life. He buried her under the maple tree near the back pasture. Her grave marked with a simple wooden cross, carved by hand. After the funeral, friends and neighbors came by with casseroles and condolences, but as the weeks passed, the visits dwindled. People had their own lives, their own struggles. The busyness of planting season returned, and Earl found himself standing alone in fields that once echoed with voices. Loneliness settled in like a heavy fog. He kept moving, kept working, because he did not know what else to do. Loneliness is not just a feeling. It can become a physical experience. Farmers often work 12 to 14 hours a day, much of it alone. For Earl, solitude sometimes felt like a companion. He could go days without having a face-to-face conversation with another person. He relied on the radio for company, tuning into a farming program in the morning and a gospel station in the evening. On Sundays, he drove into town to attend church. The congregation had shrunk over the years, but it remained a lifeline. There, he found a sense of community, sang hymns that reminded him of his mother, and shared brief conversations over coffee after the service. Still, the hours between those gatherings stretched long. Studies show that farmers face higher rates of depression and stress than almost any other profession. The risk factors are complex. Financial pressures, long work hours, social isolation, and the deep connection to land that can make the thought of losing a farm feel like losing a part of oneself. In rural America, mental health resources are scarce. In Iowa, there are far fewer psychiatrists and therapists than in urban centers, and the stigma around seeking help remains strong. Earl was raised to be self-reliant. His father never went to a doctor unless something was broken or bleeding. The idea of talking to a counselor about feelings would have been foreign to him. Yet after his wife's death, Earl began to recognize that the grief and isolation were affecting him in ways he could not handle. Alone, he had trouble sleeping. He found himself snapping at the cattle or kicking a feed bucket when frustrations mounted. He knew he needed to do something different, but he did not know where to start. One day, while picking up supplies at the feed store, Earl overheard a conversation about a hotline for farmers struggling with stress. The man behind the counter mentioned that there were people available to talk anonymously, and that the line was run by folks who understood farming. Earl took a card with the number on it. It sat on his kitchen table for weeks, tucked under a stack of seed catalogs. Every time he walked past it, he thought about calling. He imagined what he might say, how he would explain decades of worry and loss to a stranger. He pictured his father shaking his head at the idea. Finally, on a night when the loneliness felt like a heavy weight pressing on his chest, he dialed the number. The person who answered asked him where he was from and what had been on his mind. Earl found himself speaking slowly at first, then more freely, about his wife, his children, the farm, and the fear that he would be the one to let it slip away. The person on the other end listened, without judgment. They talked about stress and isolation. They told him about a support group that met at a local community center once a month. It was not therapy, just farmers talking to farmers. Earl hung up feeling lighter, surprised by how much it had helped to voice what he had kept bottled inside. A week later, he drove to that support group. There were only 6 people there, all older men and women whose faces bore the same deep lines as his own. They spoke about weather disasters, crop prices, health issues, and the children who had moved away. They laughed about the little things that only farmers understand, the way a tractor can break down at the worst possible moment or the unpredictability of livestock. Earl realized he was not alone. The others in that room knew exactly what he was going through because they were living it too. In sharing their stories, he found a sense of connection that he had not felt in years. The farm itself is a living thing, and it demands constant adaptation. Earl learned early on that the only constant in farming is change. The soil that had been black and rich when his father bought it was now more vulnerable due to decades of plowing and planting. The weather patterns that once followed predictable seasons had become erratic. One year, a drought would wither crops in the field. The next, floods would sweep across the lowlands, leaving behind silt and debris. Earl decided to change his approach. He began attending workshops on conservation tillage and cover cropping. He met younger farmers who talked about regenerative agriculture and soil health as if it were a new religion. At first, he was skeptical. He had spent his life plowing deep, turning the soil as his father had done. But he also knew that clinging to tradition for tradition's sake could be dangerous. He started small, planting cover crops like clover and rye after his corn harvest to protect the soil through the winter. He reduced tillage to preserve moisture and organic matter. He added a small herd of goats that helped manage brush and weeds. These practices improved the soil structure and reduced erosion. The results were slow, but noticeable. In the spring, the fields held moisture longer. Earthworms returned in greater numbers, a sign of healthier soil. Earl felt a renewed sense of purpose. Farming was not just about producing a crop, it was about stewarding the land so that it could support life for generations to come. This shift in mindset gave him something to look forward to. He spent evenings reading about sustainable practices, making notes and planning how to implement them. It was as if the farm itself had become a partner in his healing process. Technology also crept onto the farm, despite Earl's initial reluctance. When his daughter bought him a smartphone, he hardly knew how to turn it on, but he soon discovered that it could be a tool rather than a distraction. He downloaded weather apps that offered more accurate forecasts than the radio. He joined a community of farmers on social media who shared tips about pest management and machinery repairs. He subscribed to a podcast called Transformation that featured farmers talking candidly about stress and resilience. Listening to those voices while working in the fields made him feel connected to a wider network. He realized that technology could bridge the physical distance that separated him from others who understood his world. He began using a simple farm management software that tracked his expenses and yields, helping him see patterns that were previously hidden in handwritten ledgers. This data allowed him to make better decisions about what to plant and when to sell. He even started selling some of his produce directly to consumers through a local online marketplace. Families from nearby towns drove out to pick up fresh vegetables and eggs, and some of them stayed for a while, chatting about the farm and the weather. These interactions brought new faces to his doorstep and reminded him that there were still people who cared about where their food came from and who grew it. By embracing technology, Earl found ways to reduce his isolation and to adapt to an agriculture system that was changing rapidly. He did not become a modern technophile, but he did find a balance between tradition and innovation that allowed the farm to thrive. Adaptation is not just about practices or tools. It is also about mindset. Earl had grown up believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that a farmer should be able to solve his own problems. But the events of the past decades taught him otherwise. He began to see strength in vulnerability. He noticed that when he opened up to fellow farmers about his struggles, they responded with empathy rather than judgment. He saw that the most resilient farmers were not those who never stumbled, but those who learned from failure and accepted assistance when they needed it. Earl started to mentor younger farmers in his community, sharing both his knowledge and his mistakes. He invited a 25-year-old named Sam to help him during planting season. Sam had recently inherited a small piece of land from his grandparents but did not know where to begin. Together, they worked the fields, Earl passing down tips about soil moisture and planting depth, Sam showing Earl how to calibrate the GPS on the tractor. They traded stories about their families, their hopes, and their fears. Sam's presence brought new energy to the farm. He asked questions that made Earl think differently about old routines. He brought friends from town who were curious about farming, and soon Earl found himself giving informal tours to young people who had never set foot on a farm. He realized that by opening his gates to others, he could transform the loneliness of his work into an opportunity for connection. The farm became a place of learning and community once again. Life on the farm is still unpredictable. Earl cannot control the weather, the markets, or the broader shifts in agriculture. But he has learned to focus on what he can control, how he treats his land, how he manages stress, and how he connects with others. When a violent storm hit the county one summer, bringing hail and high winds that shredded crops and damaged roofs, Earl felt the familiar panic rising. He watched from his window as the sky turned green and the rain fell sideways. The next morning, he surveyed the damage. Corn stalks were flattened. The roof of the machine shed was torn off. Debris littered the fields. In the past, such a setback might have sent him spiraling into despair. This time, he called Sam and the other farmers from the support group. Within hours, a small convoy of trucks and tractors rolled into his yard. Men and women of all ages climbed onto roofs, hauled debris, and helped replant where possible. They shared meals at Earl's kitchen table, the same table that had sat empty for months at a time. In the face of disaster, the community rallied. Earl saw with his own eyes that he was not alone. Their collective effort reminded him that the spirit of mutual aid that had defined his parents' generation still existed, even if it took new forms. The storm's damage lingered, but so did the gratitude and renewed sense of community. Earl realized that resilience was not about being unbreakable. It was about bending without snapping, about allowing others to help when you cannot do it alone. As Earl approached his 70th birthday, he began to think about legacy. He often walked to the hill behind his house, where a large oak tree overlooked the fields. From there, he could see the patchwork of corn and soybeans stretching into the distance, the creek that wound through the pasture, and the cemetery where his parents and his wife were buried. He thought about the seasons of his life. The early years filled with hope, the middle years marked by struggle, and the later years marked by adaptation and renewal. He asked himself what it meant to be the last farmer in a line that had spanned generations. His children had built lives away from the farm, and he did not want to pressure them to return. Sam had shown interest in taking over some of the operation, but he was young and still exploring his path. Earl decided that the best way to honor his legacy was to ensure that the land itself was cared for, whether by family or by a trusted steward. He put together a plan to establish a conservation easement on part of his property, protecting it from development. He drew up a will that left the farm to his children with the stipulation that they could lease it to someone committed to sustainable agriculture. He wrote letters to each of his children and grandchildren, sharing stories about the land, their ancestors, and the values that had guided him. He hoped that even if they never farmed the land themselves, they would understand its significance and feel connected to their roots. In these preparations, he found peace. He understood that endings were also beginnings. His time as the primary steward of the farm was nearing its close, but the land would endure. Earl's story is both unique and universal. He embodies the spirit of countless farmers across America who rise before dawn, work until after dusk, face financial and emotional challenges, and yet remain steadfast in their commitment to feeding the nation. Their jobs can be lonely, but they are never truly alone. They are connected by shared experiences, by the land itself, and by the communities that still gather around them when needed. The loneliness that haunts the last farmer is tempered by the knowledge that he stands on the shoulders of those who came before, and that his work matters beyond his own life. The values of faith, family, perseverance, and honest labor do not belong to any one person. They are woven into the fabric of rural America and into the hearts of those who choose to plant and harvest despite the odds. As we tell Earl's story, we are reminded of the resilience of people who refuse to let the American dream die in their fields. We are reminded that progress should not come at the cost of those who have fed us for generations. We are reminded that the quiet heroes working the land deserve our respect and support. If this story resonated with you, share a moment when you had to find courage in solitude. Let others know where you are watching from, because stories like these connect us across miles and experiences. Subscribe to this channel if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, especially the voices of those who work in places that the world often overlooks. Join us in honoring the last farmer and the countless others who keep the Heartland alive. Seasons on the farm are like chapters in a book, each with its own rhythm, challenges, and beauty. Spring arrives quietly. Snow melt seeps into the soil, leaving behind the smell of earth and new beginnings. Earl walks the fields, boots sinking into the soft ground, testing moisture levels with his fingers. He watches the geese return, their V-shaped formations slicing through gray skies. He notes the buds on the trees, and the first crocus pushing through the thawed dirt near his wife's grave. The work begins with the preparation of equipment. He spends hours in the machine shed changing oil, replacing worn bearings, and greasing joints on tractors and planters. He orders seed, mindful of variety selection and germination rates. He calibrates his planter, making sure each row unit drops the right number of kernels per acre. There is a sense of anticipation and hope in spring. Each seed planted represents a promise, a future harvest that will either succeed or fail, depending on factors beyond his control. Spring also brings storms. Thunderheads build along the horizon, towering and dark. Earl listens for the low rumble that warns of lightning. He moves equipment to higher ground when heavy rains threaten to flood the creek. He watches radar on his smartphone, learning to interpret weather patterns with a farmer's intuition sharpened by experience. When the soil warms and the rows of corn and soybeans emerge in neat green lines, there is a brief moment of satisfaction. Life has returned to the fields, and with it, a sense of purpose. Summer is both generous and demanding. The days stretch long, the sun climbing high and baking the fields. Earl wakes before dawn to spray for weeds and insects, to cultivate soil between rows, and to check fences for damage caused by wandering cattle. Heat waves test his endurance. He spends hours on tractors without air conditioning, sweat soaking his shirt, dust sticking to his skin. He drinks gallon jugs of water and wears wide-brimmed hats to protect against the relentless sun. He watches for signs of drought stress, leaves curling, plants wilting midday, and adjusts irrigation systems where he can. There are also moments of joy. Wildflowers bloom along the roadside, fireflies dance across the pasture at night, their tiny lights flickering among the tall grasses. Calves frolic near their mothers, their playful energy a contrast to the stillness of the fields. Earl attends the county fair, entering vegetables and livestock competitions, catching up with old friends and neighbors, sharing news of crops and families. It is one of the few times during the year when the community comes together to celebrate rather than to work. Summer is when the promise of spring begins to take shape, but it is also when the risks of weather extremes and pests are highest. Earl knows that a single hailstorm or outbreak of disease can undo months of labor. Autumn is a rush of activity. Harvest time demands focus, coordination, and endurance. Earl monitors moisture levels in corn and soybeans, waiting for the perfect window when the grain is dry enough to store but not so dry that it shatters during harvest. He climbs into the combine and navigates row after row, watching grain pour into the hopper, listening to the hum of the machine. He hauls grain to the elevator, waiting in lines of trucks, chatting with other farmers about yields and prices. The air is crisp, scented with corn dust and fallen leaves. The days shorten, and work extends into the night under the glow of combine lights. There is little room for error. Equipment breakdowns must be addressed immediately. Earl carries wrenches and spare parts, prepared for the inevitable belt that snaps or bearing that seizes at the worst possible moment. Despite the stress, harvest is also deeply satisfying. It is the culmination of months of work, the moment when the seeds planted in hope become tangible results. Earl runs his fingers through a stream of golden kernels and feels pride. Harvest also brings gatherings. After long days in the fields, families and friends share potluck dinners in barns or kitchens, offering casseroles, pies, and stories from the season. Earl hosts one of these gatherings every year, inviting Sam, the support group members, and anyone else who needs a warm meal. They talk about weather, yields, and plans for next year, strengthening bonds that carry them through the solitary months ahead. Winter is both a rest and a test. The fields lie bare, covered in snow or stubble, their fertility protected by cover crops and the remnants of last season. Earl's work changes. He focuses on maintenance, repairing equipment, and planning for the next year. He calculates budgets, reviews crop performance, and orders supplies. He spends time indoors, reading farming magazines, researching new methods, and studying the records he has kept for decades. Winter is when loneliness can become acute. The days are short and cold, the nights long and quiet. The radio plays softly, and the only light comes from the lamp beside his chair. Earl writes in a journal, capturing his thoughts, worries, and gratitude. He reads the Bible passages that his mother used to read to him as a child, finding solace in the familiarity of the words. He attends the support group, where discussions often center on coping with the emotional challenges of the off-season. He goes to church and volunteers to shovel snow for older neighbors. He watches the cardinals and blue jays that visit the feeder outside his kitchen window. Winter is the season of reflection. It is a time to mourn what was lost during the year and to dream about what could be in the next. For Earl, the cycle of seasons mirrors the cycle of life: growth, struggle, harvest, and rest. Each season teaches its own lessons and demands its own kind of strength. By understanding these rhythms, he finds meaning in the monotony and purpose in the repetition. As you watch this, think about the seasons in your own life. Which season do you feel you are in right now? Share in the comments below. Are you in a time of planting, growth, harvest, or rest? Your perspective can help others feel less alone in their own journey. If you appreciate the detailed look at farm life and its cycles, consider subscribing to our channel. There are many more stories to come that reveal the hidden rhythms of the Heartland. There is a difference between solitude and loneliness, though the two often travel together across the open plains. Earl has known solitude since childhood. He would ride on the fender of his father's tractor, the engine loud in his ears, and feel the vastness of the fields around him. The horizon stretched to meet the sky, and there was a kind of peace in that endless space. Solitude allowed him to think, to pray, and to plan. In solitude, he could hear the subtle sounds of his environment: the rustle of corn leaves, the trill of a meadowlark, the distant rumble of a train. As a young man, those sounds were interwoven with the voices of his family. Even when he worked alone, he knew his father was nearby fixing a fence or his mother was in the kitchen preparing lunch. Solitude was punctuated by companionship, and it never felt heavy. Loneliness is different. Loneliness crept into Earl's life slowly. It began when his children left for college and did not return. It deepened when his wife's laughter no longer echoed through the farmhouse. It settled over him on winter evenings when the wind howled across barren fields, and his only company was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Loneliness has weight. It pushes down on the chest and makes the air feel thick. It whispers doubts in the quiet moments. Loneliness tells a man that his efforts go unnoticed, that his labor might not matter, that he is invisible in a world focused on screens and cities. Earl felt loneliness when he sat alone at the kitchen table and ate supper by himself. The chair where his wife used to sit pulled close but empty. He felt it when he looked out across his fields at dusk and saw no lights from neighboring farms because those neighbors were gone. He felt it when he drove past abandoned barns collapsing under their own weight, symbols of dreams deferred or abandoned. He realized that his loneliness was shared by many, but in the moment it felt uniquely his own. To cope with solitude and loneliness, Earl developed rituals. Each morning, he made a pot of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the world wake up. He listened to the farm reports on the radio and read the local newspaper. He started writing letters to himself. In those letters, he would recount the day's events, his thoughts, and his emotions. He would remind himself of small victories: a healthy calf born overnight, a successful repair that saved him money, a sunset that painted the sky in colors that no artist could replicate. He found that putting his feelings into words helped him process them. He also started keeping a gratitude journal. Each night before bed, he wrote down 3 things he was thankful for. On some days, those things were simple: the taste of a ripe tomato straight from the vine, a phone call from his daughter, the sound of rain on the roof. On harder days, gratitude felt like a discipline, something he chose to practice even when it did not come naturally. He wrote that he was grateful for having a roof over his head, for having land to work, for having memories of love to sustain him. Over time, the act of documenting gratitude shifted his focus from what was missing to what remained. Animals also played a role in his battle against loneliness. Earl had always kept dogs on the farm, but after his wife's passing, he allowed himself to form a deeper bond with his border collie. She became his shadow, following him from barn to field, sitting at his feet while he repaired equipment and resting her head on his knee during supper. Her presence was a reminder that companionship does not always require conversation. She was also a worker, helping him herd cattle with instincts that were a marvel to watch. Seeing her sprint across the pasture, eyes focused, body moving with precision, filled Earl with joy. She greeted him enthusiastically every morning and waited by the door each evening. There were days when her wagging tail was the difference between a good day and a bad one. Earl understood that humans are not meant to be alone. Having a creature to care for gave his days additional purpose. Caring for an animal provided structure, and structure provided stability. Earl also found solace in nature. The trees on his property became familiar friends. He knew which oak had been split by lightning, which willow leaned toward the creek as if listening for secrets in the water, which cottonwood provided shade on hot afternoons. He observed the patterns of wildlife. The deer that emerged from the woods at twilight, the fox that trotted along the fence line at dawn, the hawks that circled overhead searching for prey. These observations connected him to the larger world. He was part of an ecosystem that included countless creatures. In nature, he saw resilience and adaptation. He watched plants sprout, bloom, wither, and return. He saw animals survive harsh winters and droughts. The cycles of life around him mirrored his own experiences. The more he paid attention to those relationships, the less isolated he felt. On particularly difficult days, Earl engaged his mind in new ways. He joined an online forum for farmers, where members discussed everything from crop diseases to tractor brands. Reading about others' experiences reminded him that his challenges were not unique. He shared his own insights and received messages of encouragement from strangers in other states. He took up woodworking as a winter hobby, crafting birdhouses from scraps of lumber and old barn boards. He installed those birdhouses around his property and took pleasure in watching birds take up residence. The act of creating something with his hands, beyond farming, provided a sense of accomplishment. He also started walking more, not just for physical health, but as a form of moving meditation. Walking through his fields, pastures, and woodlots gave him time to think, to pray, and to process. He would set a steady pace and allow his mind to wander. Sometimes he would recall stories his father told him. Sometimes he would plan out the next year's crop rotation. Sometimes he would simply count his steps and breathe in rhythm with the crunch of gravel underfoot. These practices did not eliminate loneliness, but they helped him live with it. If you have ever felt the weight of loneliness, know that you are not alone. Share in the comments what practices have helped you navigate solitude. Your story could be the encouragement someone else needs. Consider subscribing if you value honest conversations about mental health, resilience, and the everyday heroes who face these challenges. Together, we can build a community that supports and uplifts one another. Behind every farm lies a complex web of economics that determines whether a year ends in profit or loss. Earl learned early that farming was as much about numbers as it was about soil and seeds. He watched his father sit at the kitchen table with a ledger, book, pencil in hand, calculating expenses and projecting returns. In those days, loans were simple agreements made with a handshake at the local bank. Interest rates were manageable, and commodity prices, while unpredictable, generally followed a trend that small farmers could weather. By the time Earl took over the majority of the farm's operations, the economic landscape had changed dramatically. The 1980s farm crisis hit small farmers particularly hard. Interest rates skyrocketed, sometimes exceeding 18%. Land values plummeted. Banks foreclosed on farms that had been in families for generations. Earl remembers standing in support lines at local auctions, watching neighbors bid on equipment that once belonged to friends who had no choice but to sell. He recalls the hollow look in a farmer's eyes when he realized his childhood home would be taken by the bank. These were not careless people. They were victims of a larger economic system that had shifted against them. Earl and his family survived that era through a combination of diversification and sheer tenacity. They planted multiple crops to spread risk, added livestock to their operation, and took on seasonal work off the farm. Earl began driving grain trucks for a nearby elevator during harvest seasons, hauling corn and soybeans for other farmers, while still managing his own fields. The extra income kept the farm afloat when commodity prices dipped below the cost of production. His wife's home business selling baked goods at local markets and fairs brought in cash that made a difference when interest payments were due. Still, there were years when the numbers on the ledger were red, when the bank account dipped dangerously low, and when the stress of unpaid bills weighed heavily on the household. Earl and his wife had serious conversations about whether to sell part of the farm to pay down debt. Each time, they decided to hold on, believing that a better year lay ahead. Farm finances are unique because the margins are often razor-thin. Earl knew farmers who took out operating loans each spring to purchase seed, fertilizer, and fuel, then paid those loans back after harvest, hoping there would be enough left to cover living expenses and reinvest in the farm. Some years there was. Other years, a single storm or a slump in global commodity prices meant the loan was barely repaid, and there was nothing left over. The sense of uncertainty can be overwhelming. Imagine investing tens of thousands of dollars in seed and fertilizer, then waiting 6 months to find out if you will break even. Earl learned to plan for the worst and hope for the best. He worked with the Farm Service Agency to apply for low-interest loans, participated in federal crop insurance programs, and attended workshops on financial planning. He also learned the language of futures contracts and basis differentials so that he could make informed decisions about when to sell his grain. The global nature of modern agriculture meant that events thousands of miles away could impact prices in Iowa. When there was a drought in South America, soybean prices might rise. When tensions in the Middle East threatened oil supply, diesel prices would spike, increasing his cost of production. Trade agreements, tariffs, and political decisions made in Washington or Beijing could affect the value of his crops. Earl followed these developments through farm newsletters and market analysis programs on the radio. He became adept at reading charts and understanding the difference between cash prices and futures prices. Yet, he was always aware that no amount of analysis could control the weather or global politics. He had to accept the inherent uncertainty and make the best decisions with the information available. During the 1990s and early 2000s, corporate consolidation in agriculture accelerated. Large agribusiness companies bought up smaller seed and chemical companies, and they pushed genetically engineered seeds and proprietary chemicals that promised higher yields. At the same time, multinational corporations began to dominate meat processing, controlling the prices paid to independent farmers. Earl faced choices about whether to buy seeds and chemicals from these corporations or to continue using conventional seeds. The new technologies offered benefits, but also increased costs and dependency on corporate supply chains. He navigated these decisions by talking with extension agents, reading research studies, and consulting with neighboring farmers. Sometimes he adopted new technology. Other times he decided the cost outweighed the benefits. He was keenly aware that once he signed a contract with a seed company, he had to buy seeds from them year after year. Independence, a core value for him, guided many of his decisions. Another element of farm economics that weighed on Earl was the value of land. He owned his farm outright, thanks to his parents paying off their mortgage, and his own frugal living, but he still paid property taxes and maintained insurance. He watched as farmland values rose dramatically during the boom years and fell just as fast during recessions. The temptation to sell a few acres to developers was always present. Several of his neighbors sold land to a company building a new housing development near town. The influx of cash helped them pay off debt, but it also reduced their future income potential. Earl chose to hold on to his land, viewing it as a legacy rather than a commodity. He understood that once farmland was turned into houses or commercial buildings, it would never return to producing food. He saw himself as a steward, not just a businessman. Despite the challenges, there were good years. High yields combined with favorable prices meant that Earl could pay down debt, invest in equipment, and put money away for the future. He remembers the satisfaction of writing a final check to the bank and knowing that the tractor was his. He recalls the pride of paying for his children's education without incurring loans. He also remembers the difficult years just as vividly, because they taught him resilience and resourcefulness. Throughout it all, he maintained meticulous records, adjusting his budget, cutting unnecessary expenses, and planning for contingencies. His wife used to say that farming was a gamble, but the gambler could stack the deck by being informed and prudent. Earl took that lesson to heart. The economics of agriculture remain complex and uncertain today. Earl continues to keep an eye on markets, interest rates, and input costs. He advises younger farmers like Sam to build financial literacy alongside farming skills. He tells them that understanding balance sheets and cash flow statements can be as important as knowing when to plant and when to harvest. He encourages them to seek out programs that support beginning farmers, such as microloans and cost-share grants for conservation practices. He warns them about taking on too much debt and reminds them that profitability is not always about expanding acreage. Sometimes it's about improving efficiency and reducing costs. By sharing his experiences, he hopes to empower the next generation to navigate the economic realities of farming without losing their shirts or their sanity. If you have experience with the financial side of agriculture or any small business, we invite you to share your insights in the comments. Understanding the economics behind food production helps us appreciate the courage it takes to plant a seed, not knowing what the world will look like by the time it is ready to harvest. Love stories in rural America are often written in dirt and sweat rather than in ink and candlelight. Earl met his wife, Margaret, at a county fair when they were both teenagers. She was judging pies at the 4-H booth, her hands dusted with flour, her hair tied back with a red ribbon. He was there to help his father with the cattle show, nervously leading a young heifer around the ring. Their eyes met in a moment that seemed ordinary at the time but became significant in hindsight. Earl admired Margaret's practicality and kindness. She could plow a field, mend a fence, bake a pie, and still make time to visit neighbors who were ill. She had grown up on a farm a few miles away, the daughter of parents who believed in hard work and generosity. When they began courting, they spent evenings sitting on tailgates, watching lightning bugs and listening to the distant bark of dogs. They discussed dreams for the future, but those conversations were grounded in reality. They knew that if they married, they would be committing not only to each other, but to a life tied to the land and to all its uncertainties. Margaret brought a unique energy to the farm. She was organized and thrifty. She kept meticulous records of household expenses, clipped coupons, and knew how to stretch a dollar without sacrificing quality. She planted a large garden every spring, filling the cellar with jars of tomatoes, beans, and pickles by late summer. She baked bread twice a week, the aroma filling the farmhouse and drawing the children into the kitchen. She also cared for the animals with a gentle hand. If a calf was born weak, she was the one who coaxed it to stand, massaging its legs and urging it along with quiet encouragement. If a storm was coming, she would help Earl move livestock to shelter, her movements swift and purposeful. She was his partner in every sense. They made decisions together, shared prayers, and celebrated together. When times were hard, she was the one who reminded him that they had survived difficulties before and would do so again. Their children grew up watching this partnership. They saw their parents work side by side in the fields, at the kitchen table, and in the barn. They learned to value cooperation and shared responsibility. Margaret insisted that each child know how to cook, clean, sew, and operate machinery, regardless of gender. She believed that skills were tools for independence. She also understood the importance of education. She encouraged the children to read, explore, and imagine a life beyond the farm, even if she hoped they would choose to stay. She attended school plays, parent-teacher conferences, and sports events, sometimes rushing straight from the barn, still wearing rubber boots. Her love was expressed through acts of service and attentiveness. She remembered the little things, favorite meals, important dates, stories told by the children. She also opened their home to others. Friends and relatives knew that they could stop by for a meal or a conversation without needing an invitation. During the harvest, she prepared dinners for anyone helping in the fields. During the holidays, she organized toy drives and food baskets for families in need. Her generosity built community bonds that endured long after she was gone. Life on the farm was not always easy, but Margaret and Earl faced challenges together. When commodity prices fell and bills piled up, she picked up extra work sewing clothes for neighbors and selling produce at local markets. She cut unnecessary expenses and found creative ways to make do with what they had. When their oldest son broke his arm during harvest, she helped run the combine so that Earl could take him to the doctor. When their daughter struggled with algebra, she sat at the table for hours, helping her solve equations despite her own exhaustion. Margaret's strength was not loud, it was steady. She rarely complained, choosing instead to focus on what could be done, rather than what could not. Earl admired and relied on her resilience. He felt stronger simply knowing she was there. Margaret was diagnosed with breast cancer just after the holidays in 2008. The news hit like a gust of winter wind, taking their breath away. There were doctor's appointments, treatments, and long days in hospitals far from the quiet farm. The illness tested them in ways they had never imagined. Margaret approached it with the same determination she brought to every task. She read everything she could about her condition, asked questions, and followed the doctor's recommendations. She continued to work on the farm when she could, wearing a scarf to cover her hair loss and smiling at neighbors who stopped by. Earl felt helpless at times, watching the woman who had always been so strong grow fatigued and weak. He took on more household duties, learning to cook her recipes, cleaning with a thoroughness she would have approved of, and keeping track of medications and appointments. His sons and daughter came home more frequently, filling the house with activity and laughter. The community rallied, delivering meals and offering rides to appointments. For a while, it seemed that love and support might be enough to carry them through. But cancer is ruthless. In the early spring of 2010, Margaret's condition worsened. Her time grew short. Earl spent hours by her bedside, holding her hand and reminding her of stories from their youth. He described the first house they built, the births of their children, the day they paid off the farm. He told her about the calves she had saved and the pies that had won ribbons at county fairs. He spoke about the garden that would bloom in spring and how her flowers would return even if she could not. In those quiet moments, he realized that love is not defined by grand gestures, but by the accumulation of small acts performed over a lifetime. When Margaret passed away, Earl felt as if a piece of his own heart had been buried with her under the maple tree. Grief engulfed him. The farm felt empty despite its acres. For months, he moved through his days in a haze, focusing only on immediate tasks because thinking beyond the present was too painful. He continued to set a place for her at the table out of habit. Sometimes he found himself talking to her as he worked, sharing thoughts as if she were still there. Slowly, through the routines of farm work and the support of his children and community, he began to learn how to live with the emptiness rather than trying to fill it. He honored her memory by maintaining the traditions she had started. Baking bread, planting the garden, and inviting neighbors in. He kept the red ribbon she wore when they first met, hanging it on a nail near the kitchen door, a reminder of the girl who became his partner in life. The love shared between Earl and Margaret is a testament to the strength of partnerships built on shared values and mutual respect. Their story underscores that behind every farm is not just a business, but a family, with its joys and sorrows. If you have lost someone who was integral to your life, you understand the depth of grief and the long road to healing. Share your stories of love and loss in the comments if you feel comfortable. Together we can acknowledge the pain and celebrate the enduring bonds that give life meaning. And if you have found this exploration of personal history moving, subscribe for more stories that honor the people who build their lives around each other and the land. Family dynamics on a farm are complex. Children grow up immersed in chores, responsibilities, and the rhythms of the seasons. They learn skills that set them apart from urban peers. They also watch their parents wrestle with uncertainty and sacrifice. Earl's children grew up knowing the weight of rain clouds and the smell of diesel. They were adept at driving tractors by the time they reached middle school. They knew that a sick calf meant midnight vigils and that a broken fence took priority over homework. They also knew their father loved them and wanted them to pursue their own paths. As the years went on, each child chose a different road. This divergence brought pride and a sense of loss. Earl's eldest son, Michael, excelled at math and science. Teachers encouraged him to apply for engineering scholarships. Earl and Margaret supported his dreams, even though it meant sending him to a university hours away. Michael thrived in college. He joined clubs, built robots, and interned at a tech company. After graduation, he found a job in Des Moines designing agricultural equipment. His work indirectly improved farmers' lives, but he rarely had time to visit the family farm during planting or harvest. Earl missed working side by side with his eldest, but he took solace in knowing that the farm had given Michael the foundation to succeed. When they talked on the phone, they discussed soil moisture sensors and yield monitors, bridging their worlds through technology. Their daughter, Anna, had a heart for teaching. She loved explaining concepts, reading aloud, and creating lesson plans for her younger siblings. Margaret noticed her gift and encouraged it. Anna earned a degree in education and took a job in a small town 2 hours from the farm. She married a fellow teacher and started a family. She visited when she could, bringing her children to experience farm life. They chased chickens, fed calves, and rode with Grandpa in the tractor. Anna often told Earl how much she valued the work ethic and resilience she learned growing up. Still, there were moments when Earl looked out at the empty bedrooms and felt the sting of absence. He would catch himself waiting for Anna to come through the back door with a stack of papers to grade, only to realize she was grading assignments in her own home now. The youngest son, David, was restless. He loved adventure and wanted to see the world beyond the county line. He enlisted in the military straight out of high school, trading cornfields for deserts and jungles. The decision frightened Earl, but he understood the need to forge one's own path. David served with distinction, traveling to far-flung places and experiencing cultures vastly different from Iowa. After leaving the military, he settled on the East Coast, working in logistics. He called the farm often, especially during planting and harvest, and shared photos of his apartment and the harbor nearby. He visited when he could, wearing city shoes that got muddy when he walked through the barn. He told Earl that the discipline he learned on the farm helped him in the military. Earl felt proud, but also aware that the line of succession on the farm had effectively ended. Earl wrestled with conflicting feelings about his children's choices. On one hand, he was proud of their accomplishments, their independence, and their happiness. On the other hand, he grieved the loss of daily companionship and the possibility of passing the farm directly to them. He sometimes wondered if he had done something wrong, if he had unknowingly made farm life appear too hard or unappealing. He wrote letters to his children expressing his love and his acceptance of their decisions. He emphasized that the farm would always be a part of their heritage, even if they did not work it. He invited them to bring their children to learn about their roots. He made sure they knew how to access legal documents, financial records, and equipment manuals. Preparing for the future became an act of love. The next generation, his grandchildren, brought a different dynamic. They visited during summer breaks, squealing with delight as they bottle-fed lambs or rode the lawnmower. They asked endless questions about the names of birds and the reasons behind each task. Earl loved these questions. He answered patiently, sometimes admitting when he did not know and suggesting they look up answers, together. He took them fishing in the creek, taught them how to bake bread, and let them help him plant trees. He was careful not to burden them with expectations. If they wanted to farm when they grew up, he would support them. If they pursued other paths, he would celebrate those choices too. His role shifted from father to mentor, from provider to storyteller. He became the keeper of family lore, passing down stories of blizzards, bumper crops, and the day the barn roof blew off. If your life has taken you away from your family's traditions, or if you have chosen a different path than the one expected of you, you may recognize the push and pull between loyalty and independence. Share your experiences in the comments. Earl's story shows that love can hold space for both pride and longing. By acknowledging these mixed feelings, we can better support each other across generations. Faith has been a cornerstone of Earl's life since childhood. His earliest memories include the sound of hymns sung by his mother as she kneaded bread dough and the sight of his father bowing his head before meals. Faith was woven into the daily fabric of their home. They read scriptures at the breakfast table, not to preach, but to anchor themselves in a set of values that guided their actions. Faith taught them patience when rains were late and gratitude when harvests were plentiful. As Earl grew older, his understanding of faith evolved. It was no longer just about attending church on Sundays. It became a source of strength in the midst of uncertainty and grief. After his wife's death, faith carried Earl through nights when loneliness threatened to swallow him whole. He found comfort in the Psalms, in verses that acknowledged sorrow and promised renewal. He prayed while walking through the fields at dawn, his words merging with the rustling leaves and chirping birds. He did not expect miraculous interventions. Rather, he sought peace and the courage to face whatever came next. He joined a small Bible study group at his church, where members discussed passages and shared how they applied them to their daily lives. These conversations grounded him. They reminded him that doubt is part of faith, and that questioning does not equal lack of belief. Earl's faith also propelled him into action. When he saw the struggles of his neighbors, he felt called to serve. He organized meal trains for families dealing with illness, coordinated volunteers to repair an elderly widow's roof, and helped raise funds for a new playground at the local school. He believed that faith without deeds was hollow. His church became a hub not just for worship, but for community service. They hosted free health clinics, blood drives, and educational workshops. Earl saw these activities as expressions of love for his neighbors. They also provided opportunities to connect with people who might otherwise remain isolated. There were times when Earl wrestled with doubt. Drought seasons stretched into months. Bank statements showed more red than black. He asked why good people suffered and why prayers for rain went unanswered. In those moments, he turned to stories of perseverance in his scriptures. He read about farmers in ancient texts who trusted the process of sowing and reaping despite uncertainty. He took solace in knowing that faith does not guarantee ease. It offers perspective. He learned that lamentation is a valid form of prayer. By expressing his frustration honestly, he opened space for renewed hope. Earl's spiritual journey also intersected with modern technology. During the pandemic, when church services moved online, he joined virtual gatherings on his smartphone. He set up his phone on the kitchen table, lit a candle, and sang hymns along with people whose faces appeared in small boxes on the screen. While he missed being in the sanctuary, he appreciated the continuity of community. He also discovered podcasts that explored spiritual themes, offering sermons and reflections that he could listen to while driving the tractor. Technology allowed him to participate in a wider conversation about faith and to access resources that deepened his understanding. As he aged, Earl thought more about the legacy of faith he wished to pass on. He wrote letters to his grandchildren explaining why certain scriptures held meaning for him. He shared stories about times when prayer had provided clarity. He encouraged them to seek their own paths, whether in a church, temple, or within nature. He emphasized that faith is not a list of rules, but a relationship with something larger than oneself. He wanted them to know that questions and doubts are part of that relationship. He hoped they would find communities that nurtured their spirits and encouraged them to serve others. If faith plays a role in your life, consider sharing how it has influenced your decisions and your ability to cope with challenges. If faith is not part of your story, perhaps you find meaning in nature, art, or community. Whatever anchors you, it is worth celebrating and sharing. Earl's story illustrates that spirituality can be a source of resilience and a catalyst for action. By honoring diverse expressions of belief, we can foster a community that supports each other's journeys. Tradition and technology may seem like opposites, but on modern farms they coexist in ways that make work both more efficient and more connected. Earl grew up in an era when farming tools were simple and mechanical. Tractors had manual transmissions, and the most advanced piece of equipment on the farm might have been a hay baler. Records were kept in spiral notebooks, and weather forecasts came from radio announcers who occasionally got it wrong. When his daughter handed him a smartphone, he viewed it with suspicion. He associated screens with distractions and worried that digital tools would erode the practical knowledge built through years of observation. However, necessity and curiosity led him to explore. The first app Earl downloaded was a weather service that provided hour-by-hour forecasts specific to his location. He quickly realized the advantage of knowing when exactly a storm might hit or when the wind would shift. He could plan spraying herbicides or harvesting grain around weather windows with greater precision. He downloaded another app that allowed him to track grain prices in real time across regional elevators. He began to see patterns that helped him decide when to sell crops and when to store them. Sam introduced him to a farm management program that allowed him to log input costs, yields, and equipment maintenance schedules. He entered data from the past 5 years and generated reports that showed which fields performed best under certain conditions. The insights surprised him. He adjusted fertilizer rates and planting densities based on data rather than habit, improving profitability and conserving resources. One of the most transformative technologies Earl adopted was GPS guidance. He installed a guidance system on his tractor that used satellites to steer the machine in perfectly straight lines. This reduced overlap, saved fuel, and minimized soil compaction. At first, he missed the tactile feel of steering, but he soon appreciated the reduced fatigue. The system allowed him to focus on monitor readouts and machinery performance. He could watch the planter drop seeds with precision and make adjustments on the fly. He also invested in a drone that he and Sam used to survey crop health. The drone captured images that revealed pest infestations and nutrient deficiencies in areas they might not have noticed from the ground. The information allowed them to target interventions, reducing chemical use and improving yields. Technology also connected Earl to a broader community. He created a social media account for the farm, posting photos of sunrise over the fields, lambs taking their first steps, and cover crop seeds sprouting through snow. He did not aim for viral fame. He wanted to show city dwellers where their food came from. The response surprised him. People from around the country sent messages of thanks, questions about farming practices, and even recipes that used seasonal produce. Some of his posts sparked discussions about soil conservation or mental health. Others simply offered a moment of beauty in someone's day. Earl also used video calls to keep in touch with his grandchildren. They showed him science projects, piano recitals, and lost teeth through screens. He gave them virtual tours of the barn and introduced them to newborn calves. Although he preferred in-person visits, these digital interactions bridged the miles. Embracing technology did not mean abandoning tradition. Earl still believed in the value of walking fields to feel the soil crumble. Between his fingers, he still rotated his livestock through pastures based on the rhythm of the grass growth rather than solely on an app. He still kept a handwritten journal alongside his digital records, finding satisfaction in the physical act of writing. He continued to attend community meetings at the church and the feed store, understanding that not everyone had access to high-speed internet or smartphones. He used technology as a tool, not a replacement. He taught Sam that balance was key. Data can inform decisions, but intuition and experience remain invaluable. Technology also posed challenges. Online forums sometimes devolved into heated debates about farming practices. Earl learned to discern which voices offered constructive criticism and which simply sought to argue. He experienced information overload when algorithms pushed endless articles and videos. He set boundaries, dedicating specific times to online activities and turning off notifications during work hours. He recognized that social media presented curated realities, and he reminded himself that a farm's health cannot be judged solely by a photo of a lush field. When trolls criticized his conservation efforts, he chose not to engage. Instead, he focused on conversations that fostered learning and connection. If you have integrated technology into your work or daily life, how has it changed your perspective? Share your experiences, both positive and negative. Earl's journey shows that embracing innovation does not require abandoning one's roots. By combining tradition with technology, we can enhance productivity, build community, and preserve the wisdom of those who came before us. As Earl looks to the future, he sees a landscape of both uncertainty and possibility. Agriculture is changing at a pace that would have been unimaginable when his father bought the farm. Climate change has introduced new variables. Rainfall patterns have shifted, bringing longer droughts and more intense storms. Summers are hotter, winters less predictable. Earl reads articles about heat stress on cattle and crop resilience. He attends meetings where scientists explain carbon sequestration and regenerative practices. He knows that farmers will need to adapt not just to economic cycles, but to environmental ones on a planetary scale. He also watches with interest as technology transforms farming. Autonomous tractors are being tested in fields not far from his own. Robotics companies are developing weed-pulling machines that use cameras to distinguish crops from plants considered pests. Vertical farms are springing up in urban warehouses, producing greens under LED lights with hardly any soil at all. Synthetic biology companies are creating lab-grown meat. These innovations could reduce land use and resource consumption, but they also raise questions about the role of traditional farmers. Earl wonders what the countryside will look like if more food production moves indoors or overseas. He worries about rural economies that rely on agriculture. At the same time, he sees opportunities for young farmers who are willing to learn new skills and embrace sustainable practices. Policy changes loom on the horizon. Discussions about renewable energy have led to wind turbines dotting the ridges near his farm. Solar companies have approached farmers with lease offers that promise steady income in exchange for converting fields to panels. Earl weighs the benefits of diversification against the loss of prime farmland. He thinks about carbon markets and whether paying farmers to store carbon in their soil could provide new revenue streams. He reads about land trusts and conservation easements designed to keep farms intact. He considers the importance of ensuring that local and regional food systems are robust, so that communities are not entirely dependent on global supply chains that can be disrupted by pandemics or geopolitical tensions. Earl also contemplates the social future of agriculture. The median age of farmers continues to rise. Many young people are discouraged by the high cost of land, the volatility of markets, and the burden of debt. The promise of remote work and urban amenities draws them away. Earl believes the key to attracting new farmers lies in making agriculture more accessible, profitable, and socially supportive. He mentors not just Sam, but any young person interested in agriculture. He advocates for policies that help beginning farmers access credit, land, and technical assistance. He supports education programs that teach business planning, mental health awareness, and sustainable practices. He believes that stories like his can inspire others to see farming not just as a career, but as a calling. Despite the challenges, Earl remains hopeful. He has seen the land rebound under careful stewardship. He has witnessed communities come together after disasters. He has experienced the power of connection in the midst of isolation. He trusts that people will continue to value real food grown by real hands. He believes that small farms offer something irreplaceable: diversity of crops and practices, local knowledge of ecosystems, and a human connection to the land. He acknowledges that corporate agriculture will persist, but he sees room for many types of farms in the future. He imagines collaborative networks of farms sharing resources, knowledge, and support. He envisions markets where consumers know the names of the farmers who grew their food. He pictures his grandchildren choosing to farm or support agriculture in other ways, perhaps through policy, research, or education. As viewers, we each play a role in shaping the future of agriculture. By choosing where we buy our food, by supporting policies that protect small farmers, by advocating for environmental stewardship, we influence the direction of the industry. Share your thoughts on what the future of farming should look like. What innovations excite you? What traditions do you hope to preserve? Your voice matters. Earl's reflections remind us that change is inevitable, but our collective actions can ensure that change leads to a more equitable and sustainable food system. Stories end, but their lessons continue to ripple through time. Earl's journey from a young boy riding on his father's tractor to a seasoned farmer advocating for mental health, conservation, and community resilience is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. He faced economic crises, personal loss, physical exhaustion, and emotional isolation. He also experienced joy in small miracles: a calf standing on shaky legs, rain arriving after a dry spell, a grandchild asking to learn how to bake bread. He discovered that loneliness can be tempered by connection, that tradition can be enriched by innovation, and that faith and science can coexist as guides. As you reflect on the chapters of Earl's life, consider your own story. Perhaps you are not a farmer, but you understand what it means to work hard without recognition, to carry responsibilities that weigh heavy, or to adapt to forces beyond your control. Maybe you have watched a loved one battle illness or have wrestled with questions about your life's direction. Earl's experiences remind us that resilience is built through daily choices: to show up, to ask for help, to extend kindness, and to continue when quitting feels easier. They remind us that community is created through shared meals, shared labor, shared tears, and shared laughter. They remind us that hope can be cultivated even in barren seasons. The Loneliest Job in America is a title that hints at isolation. But Earl's story shows that loneliness can be an invitation to reach out. By calling a hotline, joining a support group, or mentoring a young farmer, he transformed his solitude into solidarity. By attending county meetings and speaking at the State House, he turned personal pain into public advocacy. By caring for the soil and the creatures that depend on it, he honored a relationship that spans generations. By embracing technology and tradition, he wove the old and the new into a tapestry that future farmers can build upon. This video may end, but the conversation continues. We encourage you to share where you are watching from, whether it is a high-rise in a bustling city or a farmhouse surrounded by fields. Share your own stories of resilience, of community, of adapting to change. Share your hopes for the future of agriculture or any industry close to your heart. Subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more stories that celebrate quiet heroes and the values that sustain our communities. Like the turning of the seasons, our channel will return with new chapters, new faces, and new lessons. Together, we can honor those who refuse to let their dreams wither, who fight to keep the American dream alive in their fields, and who remind us that the loneliest job is not truly lonely when we choose to connect. Connection binds us together, from Earl's family and neighbors to the soil and seasons, reminding us that even the loneliest paths are woven into the fabric of our shared humanity and community.